I was going to give a bit of an overview of where I think the world's at, which sounds outrageously sort of general, but I'm going to do that because hopefully I'm going to put this on my social media and try and get more people to come to future calls and give me some money. And as Robin said, he's doing a bit of a drive for me. So thanks very much, Robin. And but having said that, hopefully it will be fairly interesting because it will provoke some discussion between you. And I think we will split up into two groups to have a little bit of a chat, and then you can come back and ask me some questions if you wish. I mean, as many of you know, right? Most of my day job is, as I like to say, where you put the biscuits on the table. I'm obsessively interested in the micro design of mobilization, and I will, in future talks, be going through some of the new developments in that area. But for better or worse, at the present time, I'm very much thinking on a sort of global COP strategy level, and I have been for a while. And that's because I think there's structural changes happening in Western societies, which is where I think I'm competent to comment on. And I'll go through some of these structural changes in a minute. But I think sometimes it is necessary to think about whether we're getting everything right on a strategic level, and arguably we're not. And as we're all aware, the world is changing.
Sorry, Roger. Looks like you got mute for me once.
Yeah, sorry about that. You miss all that.
Just the last second or two.
Oh, that's all right then. Anyway, yes. I mean, I think what I'm thinking about is what happens when the inevitable ruptures start happening, and how prepared we are for that. So, I mean, I think several of you are aware of my general orientation. So sorry if you've heard some of this before, but I'll try and bring it up to date. So if I have a look at my notes, so I'm going to talk a bit about the situation with the carbon emissions. Try to avoid saying that horrible word climate. And then I'm going to talk a bit about assemblies and civil resistance, and then make some general comments about democracy, I suppose. So one of the most sort of darkly surreal aspects of this year is the climate information we've been given has been qualitatively worse than the information being given over the last 30 years. And why it's sort of surreal is because there's been no reaction to it. And this is the frog in the hot water problem, isn't it? And I'm sure everyone on this call is probably subject to the same orientation. At the beginning of XR, we were sort of thrust into greatness, as it were, largely because of that report, if you remember, in October 2018, that says we have 12 years to save the world, to be a bit popularist about it. But the information that's come out this year is 10 times worse. And yet there's been no mobilization to speak of around the world. And I'm going to give a few ideas about why that's the case in a few minutes. But just to recap for those of you that aren't totally aware of this, but I mean, there's about 8 or 9 things I can mention, but as everyone probably is aware, the Berkeley research, I think it's Berkeley research, isn't it, came out 2 weeks ago, saying that there was a 2% chance of going over 1.5 this year in June, and now it's a 95% chance of going over 1.5. So we are going over 1.5, right, this year. And, I'm sure most of us are thinking, well, it might go over 1.5 next year. And here we are, a year early or 25 years early, if you look at what the IPCC was saying about 2050. And the other sort of mind-blowing stat is that we were 1.8 in September, which was 0.5 above the last previous hottest September in human history. And I remember, just to give a little personal detail, I actually remember the day I had a bit of a nervous breakdown about the climate. Like, you tend to have that day when it sort of dawns on you how fucked everything is. And it was in 2016 in February. And I think that's the previous hottest year. And there's scientists going, this February is 0.2 degrees hotter than any other February ever. And here we are in 2023, sort of with our desensitization hats on, going, oh, it's 0.5 hotter than ever before in the last, 100,000 years or whatever it is. And I know, we all know putting out these numbers is not the sort of thing that gets people mobilized, but amongst people on this call, we have to be aware of the situation we are in if we're going to analyze things well. The two other things, well, I'll just mention two other things, and then I want to make a general point about how we analyze all these stats. So the other thing was the wetlands paper, which said that the wetlands is churning out methane faster than ever before. And there's this problem that in the history of the Earth where you get a tipping point on methane and temperatures go up by 5 degrees in a century. And we're putting more carbon into the atmosphere than ever before, 8 to 30 times, I think the stat is. So it's a fair bet we are going to go over 5 degrees in the next 100 years. Or at least to me, that seems like the most likely scenario, which isn't to say it's going to happen. And then we had, this morbid episode of a paper finally coming out saying at 2 degrees centigrade, 1 billion people are going to be killed. And it was a really interesting paper because not only did it give a number, 1 billion people, but it actually said they were going to be killed by the rich as opposed to die. So it broke two taboos for conservative sort of peer-reviewed paper space. So I went on Nick Robinson, who those of you who aren't in the UK won't know, but Nick Robinson's one of the #1 journalists in the country. And I actually said on his show, we're going over 2 degrees and it's 1 billion people are going to be killed. And of course, there's a resounding silence. Should be like emergency meetings in some sort of sane society, wouldn't there? And surprise, surprise, the sort of conservative science space has come out to criticize me, saying, well, changing the goalposts and say, well, the people who wrote this peer-reviewed paper weren't actually that qualified. So, I've been told for 3 years, oh, you've got no evidence, Roger, of billions of people dying. And then when you finally get the peer-reviewed paper, they change the criteria, say, oh, it's not a good enough peer-reviewed paper. But as a professional sociologist, as you might say, or at least a sociologist sort of knows the basics of how social processes work, it's a totally reasonable proposition to say it's just a matter of time before there'll be 10 papers saying 1 billion people will die, right? We know the score, right? Everything's 10 years out of date. And there's nothing radical about saying that. It's just good social analysis. So it's dawned on me, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to try and communicate this, but I do a lot of work on Twitter. My Twitter sort of strategy is just, as some of you may know, is just endlessly to lay into the liberal professional classes on the assumption that people on Twitter are supposed to be quite clever, or at least those that in the climate space. So So what I am going to suggest is really 90% of climate research isn't worth the paper it's written on, because it all assumes linear analysis, if you know what I mean, which is, here's a problem, it's going to get warmer because of that problem, and at the end of it, it'll be warmer because of that problem. But it's not a problem within a system, it's 1,000 problems that all interconnect within the whole system. So you don't have to be a total genius to work out that if you just do linear analysis, it's going to be structurally conservative, what you're going to come out with at the end of the day. And for me, I think, this is my first challenge, really. So I think we need to stop doing linear analysis or supporting linear analysis. What we need to be saying is that the only valid overall analysis is to look at the Earth's history and see what happens when you take an Earth system like ours, i.e. ours, put in carbon by 8 to 30 times faster than any other point in the Earth's history. And in a century, you get 5 meters sea level rise and 5 degrees of warming. And that has to be the main analysis, right? And everything that you see what I mean, because you're having a full analysis compared with a full analysis of a previous period. So as I said, I like this idea of saying it's the main scenario, right? Rather than whether something's wrong or right, which obviously is ridiculous in the prediction. So it's not saying it's definitely going to happen. And, there's all sorts of possibilities, and discuss another call, or you might want to ask questions about, geoengineering and such like. But as several people have said to me over the last 3 months, everyone knows, the science community knows the show's over. They're just not telling us because, otherwise they'd be completely stupid. So the future is slashing carbon emissions and massive Earth repair, so stroke geoengineering, which raises interesting questions, by the way, about what a political revolution is going to look like. Because if we go back to some primitive, pre-industrial, bliss in inverted commas, then we're all going to die because we need geoengineering. You see what I mean? So one way or another, we're stuck with modernity. And lots of people don't like that idea, of course, because it, conflicts with various alternative ideologies, the romanticism of the pre-industrial period and what have you. But as far as I can see, the survival of the human race trumps our romanticism. And those people that are romantic probably don't know what it's like to be romantic, i.e. to starve. So it seems like that's what we're stuck with. And I'm saying that as an analyst, right? I'm not making ideological comments about it. I think that's one of the biggest challenges coming up, is to communicate this reality to the general public and within the movements we're part of. The other challenging thing is, and this is a bit pessimistic, but I think it's a reasonable possibility, which is when I was doing my research at King's College, I did quite a lot of work on complexity theory, which just informed what I've said really about whole system analysis. But without using all the big words, one of the interesting things about it is when a complex system is about to collapse, there's a period of calm. There's an eerie calm before the storm. So we know this phrase, don't we? Calm before the storm, which sounds, like some sort of fairy tale-esque sort of wisdom. It's like, why? But apparently it's quite a valid mathematical prediction when you have a complex system. And I don't, it's somewhat speculative, but I feel like the sort of loss of momentum in self-described climate movements is partially because of an exhaustion with the inability to break through. And I think there's a strong possibility that next year will be quite miserable because people will be having their last gasp of reformism before the big ruptures start happening. And in particular, of course, there's massive pressure in our country, in the UK, to support Labour on the age-old guilt trip that if you don't vote Labour, you'll let the Tories in, even though mathematically, as I've said in a Facebook post, it was largely ignored. There's absolutely no difference between the Tories and the Conservatives on the maths, right, on the physics, because we both parties are not going to catch the ball, and this is the objective analysis of all reformist sort of strategies across the Western world. And this is an objective point, right? I'm not making, as you know, I'm not necessarily opposed to reformism, but if reformism means you walk down the hill after the ball, it doesn't matter whether you stand still or walk after the ball, right? The only way you're going to get the ball is running, i.e. a revolutionary strategy. But I'm not an expert on the US, and there's people here from the US, but I'm sure, you can see the same situation, and in France and Germany as well, is a sort of form of social madness where people, as things get worse, people become even more obsessed with supporting a dysfunctional strategy, i.e. a reformist strategy, because it holds some sort of false hope. And so don't be surprised if everyone says Biden's going to sort out the climate yet again. So as I have got something positive to say, though. But I've been involved in this project called the Humanity Project, which is to get assemblies on the go. And I'll say more about it in a minute. But what's been quite interesting, I've been going around the UK, and I've done about 7 or 8 talks now, where I've basically said, look, guys, this system is not going to last. That's an objective reality. And what's going to come after this system isn't a puff of smoke and everything disappears. We actually have to analyze what social breakdown looks like. And the default outcome of social breakdown is various forms of fascism. And I say various forms because there's, vaguely unpleasant fascism, and then there's, full-on Nazism, and then there's Nazism in 1945, which I'm reading about at the moment. And I think we need to have the moral strength and the intellectual strength to understand how these fascisms work, and what the dynamics are that lead to fascistic outcomes. But I don't think I need to argue with you lot about, fascism being the default, because it's clear from history, when you have times of extreme social stress, there's enormous pressure to find scapegoats and to indulge in nihilistic, outpourings of violence. And we've seen, dare I say it, this sort of dynamic playing out in Israel and Palestine at the present time. And, there's nothing unusual about that historically, even though every time it happens, it's beyond awful. So what I am working towards as a general positive strategy is that we have to engage in creating revolutionary organizations that have a self-understanding of being revolutionary. And I have a little bit of an internal debate with myself whether you should use that word in the same way as we sort of had internal conflicts, as Robin knows, at the beginning of Extinction Rebellion, when, various people of liberal persuasions were saying, you can't say rebellion, can't say rebellion, for God's sake, we've all got to be nice, and using the word revolution is sort of problematic in the same way, but also exciting in the same way. And I've had lots of people say to me, things like, I think in the Western imagination, people assume that revolution has something to do with the sort of disaster of communism, as it were, in 1920s and 1930s. But of course, there's two other social meanings of revolution. There's the liberal revolutions between 1770 and 1848. In other words, there's, in the historical record in Western societies anyway, and also obviously in the global South in the anti-colonial struggles, but there's a strong tradition of democratic revolutions that remain democratic. And then, of course, we've also got the meaning system around the Orange Revolutions or whatever, since 1989. So I think what we need to do, and obviously it's going to be a battle, but changing frames is always a battle, is say, yes, it can be a revolution. It's going to be a 21st century revolution, and that's the frame. So you put 21st century, and then people's imagination start thinking, oh, maybe there could be something new. And this is our role as pioneers, is to say, we are doing something new. And when people say, oh, what won't work, you'll say every change in history never worked until it did work, right? Once upon a time, democracy was some quaint idea of ancient Athens, and 10 years later, the French Revolution happened, and all the rest of it. We know how that goes. But the advantage of using the frame of revolution is to make clear that we need a massive structural change in society all at the same time, which is political, social, and spiritual. And again, people will say, well, that hasn't happened before. And you can say, well, we haven't been putting carbon into the atmosphere 30 times faster than any other point in the Earth's history. In other words, if something new happens, something else new is going to happen, right, in response to it. And I'm not going to be saying for a minute I've got all the answers to it, although I think we've got some good pointers. So what I'm trying to persuade people about at the moment is if we move this revolutionary orientation, and this is what I'm arguing in Just Stop Oil and having a bit of a battle in the Humanity Project about, is it will make us less popular in the short term. But the short term is not good strategy, right? In the medium term, when these ruptures happen, we will gain from the integrity and strategic coherence that none of the rest of the liberal reformist space is going to be able to benefit from. And history is chock full of this dynamic. So I'm just going to give you like 3 sort of examples of ruptures which are within our memory, just to show you how this is going to work. So the most famous one is Syriza. So as some of you know, right, Syriza was the Marxist party in Greece, and for better or worse, I'm not saying it's had a great ideology necessarily, but in terms of sociological analysis, it was on 4% of the vote, I think, for a decade or two, and the reason it was on 4% of the vote was because it had a stupid strategy, right, which was to maintain its ideology of revolutionary change. And if we remember the 1990s and the 2000s, anyone who said they were revolutionary was obviously stupid, probably was. But they maintained that faith, as it were, in the ideology. So when the crash came and, the collapse of the economy happened around 2013, 2014, I think, then it benefited from being outside the system, number one, not being contaminated with the stupidity of reformist illusions. And it went to 40% of the vote in, I think, 6 months. Maybe you can correct me on that, certainly within a year. Now, the point here is I'm not making comments about Syriza itself, right? I'm saying that the reason it went from 4 to 40 was because it was on 4. You see what I mean? The reason it went to 40 was because it was on 4, not because it was on 15 or 20, because it made compromises, right? And this is just an observation. You can see the same thing happening, of course, on the radical right and with fascism or what have you, not least with Hitler in 1933. But the other 2 examples are 9/11 and Ferguson, right? With George Floyd. And in both of those situations, again, they're very different in many ways, but the similarity is this an explosion of social disruption. Obviously, with 9/11, with 5,000 people dying, and what that led to is total reconfiguration of American foreign policy. And with Ferguson, with Black Lives Matter being, maintaining its integrity, but being very small. And suddenly, millions of people and millions of pounds coming into that space. So what I'm trying to say is what we have to communicate to the radical movements around climate is that no one's going to take any notice of them. And then there's going to be 1 million people on the street. And everyone's going to be going, what do we do? Tell us what to do. And we have to be really clear that that's going to happen because it's physics. This isn't a social prediction. It's not Marx saying there's going to be a revolution, right? This is when it gets to 2 degrees, 1 billion people are going to be killed. I mean, you only need a tenth of that to create revolutions, right? So it's in the bag. So I'll give you a few sort of little bit of update on what I'm trying to do in the 2 spaces I'm in sort of climate action space and in the assembly space, and just to give you a sort of outline of the sort of conflicts and challenges that are happening at the moment. In the climate, in the assembly space, the big problem is assemblies, citizens' assemblies, and to a certain extent, people's assemblies have been what I would call performative tokenistic spaces, right, for 10, 20 years now. What that means is either the government sets them up or local councils set them up, and they actually undermine the credibility of themselves because, as everyone knows, they happen, and then no one takes any notice because they're not publicised, or the questions that are asked and the experts are obviously skewed towards a liberal space, or they're just ignored by the government, like the one in France was. So that's a classical example when they had a lot of publicity for the French Citizens' Assembly on climate. And if I've got my facts right, I think 10% of the proposals have been actually enacted, which should come as absolutely no surprise because it's absolutely impossible to act rationally on the climate without revolutionary change, right? And obviously, Macron isn't going to challenge the neoliberal system. So this is entirely predictable. So at the moment, we have this enormous tension between the reformist space and the revolutionary space, because the reformist space wants to keep the old playbook, right? They want to do tokenized individual assemblies, which are lovely, but go nowhere. And then on the other side of the equation is me, and I'm arguing you have to come into the assembly space with an entirely new revolutionary strategy. So you need to stand up in front of the assemblies and say, we're going to have a revolution in Britain. You're going to lead it and you're going to run it. You see what I mean? And obviously, 10% of the audience might walk out because they're Tories. But my argument is it doesn't matter, right? What matters is to give people concretized hope, not hope in a sort of, waffly way. And maybe I shouldn't use that word. But what I mean is a vision and a theory and a strategy of change, which is not the Labour Party or not Biden. And strangely enough, my bet is ordinary people are a lot more radical than we give them credit for at this stage in history. And the real problem here is middle-class gatekeepers, right, who don't want to actually go to the people and give them the opportunity to create their political futures. And, and the way to do that is to keep it atomized, keep the questions liberal, don't have all the raucousness, but you need raucousness, right? So for instance, no disrespect to the person, I have a little bit of a difference of opinion, but there's a move to have assemblies leading to a candidate in Camden against Keir Starmer, right? Because, I don't know if you know, but Camden in the UK is probably the 10 most radical constituencies in the country. And it's got this guy, Starmer, who's, Mordor, as I like to call him, right? And so we're going to have assemblies and put up an alternative candidate. But my frame here is karma for Starmer, partially because it rhymes, right? But partially because it's funny, and partially because it's aggressive. You see what I mean? But I've been told, by 1 or 2 people, that's not appropriate because it's divisive. So for me, this is the essence of middle-class activist gatekeeping in the Western space, right? That has to be broken down. that people do need to do a good amount of swearing. They do need to be disruptive. They do need to use street speech, because otherwise everyone thinks you're just more of the same, which you are, essentially. So there's that challenge, right? And it's a very difficult challenge because the reformists are probably correct. In the short term, you're going to get more traction by playing by the rules, right? Because the rules reward you. But once the rupture happens, no one's going to give a fuck about you, right? They're going to be looking for either fascism or some pro-social revolution. And if there's no pro-social revolutionary pathway, you know what people are going to do, because we've seen it 100 times, right? You know, it's like, okay, we're going to blame someone and kill them. So the other thing, I'll try and wrap up in a minute. The other aspect is the climate action space, which arguably is more receptive. And I think why the climate action space is more receptive is because of the visceral experience of state repression. You know, I'm not the only person in the UK to have been put in prison for 4 months, right, for doing nothing other than talking to people like you, right? And what that does, you know, once you've been in prison, in one of the worst prisons in Europe for 4 months, you come out with a certain degree of, what's the word, revolutionary solidity in your veins, right? You know, and with Just Stop Oil, I feel like there's a good probability that we will explicitly become a revolutionary organization in the next 3 months. And what that means is supporting a whole range of social and democracy and climate issues in inverted commas, so that we build up a revolutionary non-violent alternative to the Starmer space, right? And again, this could mean we're in the wilderness, right, for the next year, because everyone will be going, you're ridiculous, you need to support Starmer, you know, you're betraying people and all the rest of it. But we have to have the revolutionary faith. And I think there's enough people that understand that, not least Dean, see, because he's nodding, put him in to nod for me. I always plant a few people, you know, just revolutionary strategy. Anyway, but you see what I mean, right? You know, in the short term, it's probably better to keep with the Fridays for Future, you know, XR waffly sort of routine, right? Because everyone's happy, even though it's ineffectual. But I think this will be the new strategy. And what this strategy means is getting rid of the words democracy, social, and climate. There is one single crisis, and we need to find some framing around that, right? And it probably means using lots of Anglo-Saxon words to describe what we're doing. But that's really the challenge. Because one of the things I've been thinking recently is if you want to know what's happening on the climate crisis in inverted commas, right? You shouldn't look in the climate crisis section of The Guardian. You should look in the economic section, the business section, and the social section, right? So, for instance, you know, as you probably know, the biggest issues coming up are insurance, right? California, Florida, right? And, oh God, what's the other one? And the coastal property bubble, right? Both of which are way past, you know, collapse time in the United States, right? And they're going to collapse. Everyone knows they're going to collapse because it's structurally locked in. So this is what I mean is what we need to find a language which is actually about changing everything that we do without sounding naff. I'm not that great on framing. It's not really my patch, but I think that's a challenge to us all. And the last thing I want to say is I think we need to change the framing around mobilization. The mobilization logic has been very utilitarian for 4 or 5 years now. In other words, it's like, let's go and mobilize ordinary people, and then we'll get more people to get arrested, and then we'll win. I think the frame has to change to more of a virtue frame, which is we believe in democracy. We need to talk to ordinary people because they deserve to know and they deserve to be able to assemble and co-create their future. In other words, it's an end in itself, because even if we're going to totally fail, the least we can do as Democrats, true Democrats, is actually speak to our fellow citizens. And by speak to our fellow citizens, I mean stalls, leaflets, posters, and door knocking, right? I mean the grit, right, of it. And any strategy that doesn't include those four things is just, performative bollocks, basically. You have to get out and talk to ordinary people, because ordinary people will vote fascism if they don't feel there's critical masses pointing in another direction. And, I know some of you nodding at this in various countries which have no strategy for contacting ordinary people. But I've said it over and over and over again. The reason XR became a mass movement in the UK because people got out and talked to ordinary people, in places like South Africa and Denmark, it didn't happen. What happened was people within the space talked to other people within the space and tried to nick them or form, dysfunctional alliances. That's totally fact. We're all going to be having a lovely meeting in Hackney, and then the police will come in and arrest everyone, and no one's going to come and support us. That's what's going to happen. It happened in 1933, as I'm sure many of you know, right? You have to get out there. And, it's happening like in Germany at the moment. No one's going to talking to the miners in East Germany, right? People need to be out talking to those guys and enabling them to engage in public speech and engage in assemblies, so they feel like there's something other than voting for alternative to Germany. You see what I mean? It couldn't be more serious, right? Fascism is not nice. I don't want to reel off a whole load of stats of what it was like in April 1945 in Berlin, which is what I'm reading about at the moment, but it's off the scale. But on the other hand, to leave it on a positive note, right? This is our life now, and we know what we need to do. And the strategy that I'm suggesting to you all is the correct strategy. So there we are. End on a dogmatic statement, but you can, pull it apart after you've been in the breakout groups. And I'll leave it like that. Thanks very much. And this always sounds embarrassing, but I'll just say is I'm trying to revamp the Roger Hallam brand. I know that sounds so bad, doesn't it? But anyway, I sort of decided, fuck it, I'm just going to promote myself because no one else is saying what I'm saying the way I say it. So, lots of people come along in years' time, I can, revert back to whatever. But, I thought on balance, that's what I should do. And obviously, I'm hoping that you will trust that I don't turn into some cult leader or something. I'm sure you'll let me know when that happens. No Rolls Royces, all that sort of thing. But seriously speaking, I'm trying to get myself on more of the media. I talked to the ex-Environment Minister of the UK the other day, what's he called? Zach Goldsmith, and I was on Political Conversations, which is a big program. So I'm hoping to get around a bit more because, as I said, there's no one actually telling people, number one, with fact, and number two, we need a revolution. So that seems to be a good reason to get myself out and about. And thanks very much, Robin. I would publicly thank Robin for helping on this and everyone else. And, at the danger of cringing again, yes, if you do feel like giving me mum of your hard-earned money, then feel free. But it has gone up. So, it just enabled me to be more independent and, not have to rely on various day jobs. Anyway, so, we thought we'd get that in first. So the plan is you're in groups and you've democratically come up with a question. You notice that? So my new democratic design. Anyway, does someone from one of the groups want to say what your question was, or you can have a little bit of a comment on the question, but hopefully no 20-minute speeches, please. Terry's always first off, isn't he?
Naturally, I jump right in. It was interesting in our group. I mean, even within like-minded and kindred spirits, like we all are in this gathering, the distinction came up in the conversation between what you might call, and this is a Jim Bendell word based on his recent book, Breaking Together, what you might call the doomster versus the doomer, both of whom recognize the dire circumstances we're in, but the reaction is different. There's one side, that the doomster side, I might say, that sees the inevitable, the abrupt event that's already happening, the rupture, as you referred to it, Roger, that kind of pivotal event that's going to keep happening until everything falls apart. But anyway, then there's another view that's more of what I would call not dreaming, but more hopeful than is hard to justify sometimes. They see their community surviving, by going into eco gardening and, doing things like that. So my question becomes, if we're out talking to people, how do we address that divide, even within people that are like-minded and people that are kindred spirit with respect to the issues we're facing? Because there are some who still cling to a kind of optimism that their family, or at least a significant percentage of the population, will survive. And then there's those who, on the other end of the scale, think, no, anyone alive today has about a 1 in a quadrillion chance of surviving the next 50 years. So my question is, how do we address that divide?
Well, dare I say, I've got a pretty clear idea on what needs to happen. And I think we're all swimming in the fishbowl of materialism, right? On the left and the right. And this has been hegemonic since 1989. Those of us who are old enough to remember, periods before that will remember there were ideologies before 1989 which were not materialistic primarily. They're what we might call idealistic. Or what I'm trying to say is that the way you frame the question, Terry, is a question that is a framing that has to go, right? We don't. The focus on survival is at essence a materialistic frame. That's what most people in history aren't primarily concerned with survival. Like most people have a non-materialistic frame in before 1989, and also, of course, people that don't have a public voice, right? A lot of working class people or traditionally minded people are not materialistic. What I mean by that is their primary orientation is to fulfill their duty to their values, and there's no expectation of the importance of surviving or not. I mean, obviously, I'm exaggerating somewhat. Obviously, humans are biological animals and we like to survive. But we should make clear that that's not the main thing that makes human beings tick. The main thing that makes human beings tick is love, duty, honor, right? Those three things: love and duty and honor towards those in our family, those in our community, and those in our country, and arguably for some, the whole of the human race. And what we need to do is challenge the whole meta-materialistic frame. So, in other words, let's say you're in an interview, Terry, and you say, well, Roger, are we going to survive? I'm going to say, that's not the important question. The important question is, are we going to be good people before we die? What does being good mean? Being good means we're going to come together and work together and be civilized and be kind and compassionate towards each other. And we're going to find a way through to the extent there is a way through. And if there isn't, there isn't. But it's not our job to work that out. It's our job is to fulfill our humanity at this time of massive crisis. Full stop. You see what I mean? So do you undermine the whole elite, utilitarian, materialistic frame? Because all that frame is going to collapse into a suicidal, psychotic mess, right? Because people can't live in that world. Because if you're a materialist, the world is going to disappear, so you're not going to be happy. And if you're a utilitarian, you're not going to be happy because nothing's going to work. You see what I mean? But if you have an idealistic philosophy, I mean that philosophically, not politically. If you feel like it's consciousness and mind which basically run the world, not this base material stuff, then it isn't actually enormously important whether the human race survives or not, in a sense, right? I don't want to go to an extreme. And it doesn't matter whether something works or doesn't work, because as we know, the world changes when people who don't care whether things work go into action, because they're not subject to the collective action problem. In other words, people don't think oh, I'm not going to help my neighbor because no one else is helping their neighbor. They'll say, I'll help my neighbor because I'm a decent fucking person, right? You see what I mean? It's like, and so the whole of this like suicide culture, global elite culture, is irredeemably utilitarian, irredeemably materialist. And it's all fact. It's morally fact, but it's existentially fact, right? And we shouldn't answer the question within that materialistic frame. We start from a new frame, which is, you know, what are we going to do together for the rest of our lives? That's the question. How do we live a decent life? You know, how do we fulfill our values? How are we going to face our children in 10 years' time with some sense of self-respect? And it's possible, right? It's possible. Probably end up with all being put into prison, but so what, right? So what? You know, seriously, so what? What's important isn't being put into prison, not being put into prison. What's important is your self-respect in the deepest sense of the word. Anyway, you know, you've heard me say this sort of thing before, but it's really important we don't get into this scarcity, you know, materialistic, scaredy. That's the frame of fascism, isn't it? It's like, we've only got so much time. We've only got so many people in the country. You know, we need to stop. We need to, you know, these are our resources. This is our land. You know, kill them. Right? We see this in Gaza. Well, you know, we've got a massive case study of it at the moment, and it's like at the you know, I'm going to do a Facebook post about it, but like at the back of our minds is the utter stupidity of hate. You know, it's in everyone's mind, isn't it? It's just like, yeah, they killed us, and yeah, we're killing them, and it's all totally fact. You know, the only way forward is love and forgiveness, not because we're being waffly hippies, right? But because we're total realists. We're total realists. Because if we're going to continue with that frame, we're going to destroy the human race. And this is the, you know, there's a word in theology for it. It's the end times, right? There's this end time. What's it called? You know, Terry, right? You know, I'm sort of morbidly fascinated by theology of this thing. And basically, it's saying like time and space don't matter anymore. What matters is the ultimate confrontation with what it is to be human, because we're either going to massively change, or we're just going to destroy ourselves. You know, and I'm a total practical guy, as you know, but I totally believe that. Right? There's no way we're going to get through this without this massive transformation. And what we know as sociologists and you know, people who've studied history, is massive transformations do regularly happen in human consciousness over and over and over again, right? Just give you one example. Sorry, you got me going on now, but just give you this quick example, right? Which is, I've told you this before, and I don't know the details, so apologies if someone knows this better than me. But when corn came to North Mexico, I think it was New Mexico, there was a civilization there, and corn came along, and it was, you know, it's a wonder crop, right? And the population massively increased, and they had a great time, and you know, this was wonderful, and you know, the civilization boomed away. And then, you know, the story, it's always the same story, isn't it? They over, you know, what's it called? Overstretched, right? The climate changed, the corn failed, they all starved, everything was fucked. But what's really interesting is after that, they never planted corn ever again. You see what I mean? So this is, to me, that's an analogy of what's going to happen over the next 30 years. Is everything to do with this civilization is going to become a complete taboo for the people that have been born this year. Maybe not, right? But it's going to be in that ballpark. And that's the extent of psychic change which we need to entertain. So it shouldn't concern us at all that some reformists are going, well, that won't work. You know what I mean? It's like, we're looking at the long term, mate. You see what I mean? This is, you know, we're like the Communist Party in 1905, you know, with 43 people in a London pub going, we're going to take over Russia, and everyone going, yeah. But then the World War I started, right? You know, I mean, it's a good analogy. Don't get me wrong, by the way, Daily Mail journalist here, not a communist. But, you know, but you see, seriously, you see how these dynamics work, right? Got to get ourselves out of this headspace of you know, Stormerism and variations on the theme. You know, it's just ugly and it's bollocks. Anyway, sorry. I do like questions. It enables me to ramble on a lot.
Thanks, Roger. Right, you've given us a little slot left. So if someone else wants to throw in a question, we could still probably do one more, and then unfortunately maybe we save them for next time. But also,
we have two more because that was bad. I'll try and keep the next one because otherwise people feel bitter and twisted that they didn't get their grievance.
I see a lot of bitter faces out there. Yeah,
there'll be more cancellations. That'll be it.
But we'll do more regular calls so people know. Yeah, we'll have this. So I saw Elliot's hand first, I think. Go ahead, Elliot.
Hi everyone. Hi, Roger. So on the revolutionary aspect, sort of going back to what you said about us being stuck with modernity, do you think that in the event of this revolutionary action, which we want to be taking, that the British state could be overcome? Or do you think it's something that we should be trying to reform in a revolutionary way?
Yeah, so the technical definition of a revolution, which isn't to say it's the only definition, but the technical definition, sociologically speaking, is a change in the regime, not a reconstruction of the state or the getting rid of the state, classically speaking, right? So, you know, you have change of a government, you have change of a regime, and then you have getting rid of the state. Those are three separate things, formally speaking. So for the sake of argument, I'm saying revolution is change of the regime, right? So, you know, as people on this call know, right, lots of us are involved in the idea of a citizens' assembly constitution. You know, broadly speaking, there's variations on the theme. That's a revolution. You know, sociologically, that's a political revolution, right? And then you have a social revolution, which is, you know, reconstruction of society on the basis of common ownership, let's say, rather than, you know, global capital. That's the social revolution. And you have a spiritual revolution, which arguably can get rid of the state because everyone's nice to each other because they've got all spiritual sort of thing. That's all a little bit more vague. But I think what I'm concretely, you know, involved in designing is a new regime. And when I say revolutions are inevitable, I'm saying political revolutions are inevitable. And there's a good chance, of course, if political revolutions are inevitable, they will lead to social revolutions because, you know, global capital is going to break down under the force of mass migration and all the rest of it, right? All of that is totally normal, right? In terms of, you know, modern history. You know, most Western states have had a revolution or a war every 30 to 50 years for the last 300 years. And before that, they were, you know, getting done in by one thing and another every 20 years. So we need to be really clear. And this is what I mean about ideological clarity, right? We can't go into the social space saying, oh, let's have an assembly and we're all going to make nice decisions. We have to go in with this ideology. And everyone will think we're dicks, but it doesn't matter because we're right, in the same way as the Communist Party was right in 1905. You see what I mean? And it's like an ideological investment. But if you do that, and of course you need to make sure you've got a functioning organization, which is another big subject, right? But assuming you can do a functional organization, like Just Stop Oil, for me, like it's the thing that has the most integrity, but it's also the most strategically smart thing to do, particularly if it's concretized into a program of what a revolution looks like. Because if you go to Bedford or something, right, and say, hi, I'm Roger Hallam, we're going to have a revolution, and I'm going, what a dick, right? But if you say, look, we're going to have a revolution, and this is what it's going to look like, right? We're not going to have political parties anymore. We're going to have citizens' assemblies, and they're going to run the show. And this is how it's going to work. And here's the timeline. You see what I mean? Lots of people, that's what people want to hear. They don't want to hear, oh, let's have a revolution and it's going to be great with sort of, you know, no disrespect, some student waffling on, right? That's all bollocks. But they also don't want to hear, oh, we can have an assembly in Bedford and you're going to talk to each other and it's going to be lovely. And then we're going to decide how the world's going to be better. They're going to go, fuck off, like we've tried that, right? You're just wasting our time. They want to be led. That's my sort of big proposition. People want to be led, but they want to be led with integrity and coherence. into a revolutionary future. So that, you see what I mean? There's a third scenario there in terms of what the communication is. And I've done this 3 or 4 times, and without sounding too big-headed, I think I can do. I think I could talk to a bunch of British people, and I'm going to excite them, because I don't know what it's like in other countries, but everyone in the UK knows everyone is totally fucked off, right? It's just miserable. It's miserable, and I'm 57. I've never known a time, and I'm sure the people in this call have never known a time where more people, have been more pissed off than now. And it's something like only 8% of the British public wants no constitutional political change. I mean, that's what 90% of people want something big and different. But we're not going to be able to sell this without some evangelical vigor. You see what I'm saying, Elliot? Do you get it? It's like we can't go into ordinary British spaces as liberal academics and go, we've got a bit of a problem and let's all now have breakout groups. There's got to be some jazz in there and some grit, and say we're going to fuck over Starmer. You see what I mean? Not because we're going to fuck over Starmer in some nasty far left way, but it's just enjoyable saying so. You see what I mean? It's enjoyable actually giving people permission to express their visceral alienation from what they've been, at the betrayal that they feel. And that's dangerous. You need to have limits on it, right? But there's ways of doing that. We've got quite a lot of social technologies out there, right, to make sure people don't go in the street and start throwing bricks, right? Anyway, there we go. Work in progress. Well, in my humble opinion, the most interesting thing happening in the Western world is happening in the boring city of Hull. But I could be wrong, of course. So just before they all get big-headed if they hear that. But yeah, I mean, about 7 or 8 people that have been involved in GSO and XR, went to Hull in classic, go to the people fashion, and they've done people's assemblies, one every 2 or 3 weeks, and they've done 7. And the stats are that between 40 and 80 hours of labour gets 70 people in the room. So, being the nerdy person I am, that's it. That's the model for the revolution, because I know that can get replicated. You can do that in Hull. You can do it in 60%, 70% of places around the Western world. And it's a combination of leafleting, door knocking, and stalls and posters, right? So what I think's interesting about this is what I've been saying for a while, which is that the institutional space in Western democracies is irredeemably reformist, right? Even at a local level, and arguably sometimes more at a local level. What I mean by that is people are so demoralized in institutional spaces, they've lost the imagination and the courage to basically engage in some opposition to that reformist space. And the people who are going to make the revolution, inverted commas, are outside that space. And the reason they're outside that space is not because they don't care or they're not clever. It's because they're extra clever. They've worked out that nothing works, and that's why they're not in an institutional space. They've exited the institutional space. You see what I mean? And so what the whole people have shown is this process of creating assemblies can be built up from the bottom up with relatively few resources and a lot of labor, which is exactly what we did with XR, right? Which people don't realize, is we had like hundreds of meetings before it all started taking off, and it was all a bit, it was a bit of a grind. And as some of you know, like Insulate Britain was the same, it's like 60 meetings, 1 person per meeting. But this is how you get to a critical mass. And this is, everything's bollocks unless people get out and do this work, as I said at the end of my talk. But what this shows is the stats work, right? Because you can get 60 people in the room, then, potentially next time you can get 200 people in the room. There's a whole bunch of things that need to be designed over and above what happens after those assemblies. And there's a big challenge around this, which, I can go into maybe in a future talk. But broadly speaking, there has to be concrete pathways to action after the assembly. So what I'm trying to encourage them to do in Hull is to have 10 assemblies in Hull, in the different postcodes of Hull, the different regions of Hull, which is what, about 250,000 people, Hull, 500,000, you know, it's a pretty average Western depressed city, as you might say. And then you have an assembly for the whole of Hull. So everything is geared towards that assembly, which is going to happen in the whole of Hull. And at that assembly, you make the decision to stand in the city elections. And you have some hustings, and you choose ordinary people to stand in those elections. And those people stand in the elections as representatives of the assemblies. So you institutionalize the assemblies around the city, a bit like Porto Alegre. And then there has to be a national strategy, otherwise you end up like Porto Alegre, right? So this is our role, is we need to concentrate on how to get through these stages. But there has to be a national vision, and there has to be an international vision, because people want answers on that, right? So you can say, okay, you're going to stand in national elections, we're going to have a House of Citizens, and it's going to happen in 5 Western countries all at the same time, right? So people can see that pathway to something credible. And you know, that's the challenge. So yeah, Hull's the good news, not just talking rubbish. Just need to go and do it. So everyone in the UK, I'll probably send you an email inviting you to Humanity Get Together, and then we can talk more concretely, because I want something in Portsmouth, isn't it, Dean? Portsmouth.
We've been doing Plymouth. It's changed for Plymouth, and we've been doing people's assemblies. We've had about 10 of them. Yeah,
exactly. Anyway, so balloons are coming up, so you can do a testimony next time. Shut me up. Anyway, good. So but that's it. That's ending on a positive note, isn't it? Right. So in any city in the Western world, the grittier the better. In some ways, human beings at this point in history do want to meet together and discuss why the facts, everything is fucked, right? And they'll come up with interesting solutions to that. And that's what we need to do as Democrats in the original sense of the word. I think that's it, isn't it?